What if the person sitting in your therapy office isn't the whole story? What if the anxiety, depression, anger, withdrawal, or acting out behavior you're seeing is connected to something happening in the person's relationships? That question takes us to Virginia Satir. Satir was one of the pioneers who helped us transform psychotherapy from something that primarily focused on the individual into something that could also examine the relationships and systems surrounding that individual. She became known as one of the major pioneers of family therapy, but her work eventually went far beyond it. She was interested in communication, self-esteem, human potential, emotional expression, and perhaps most importantly, how people could change. In this episode, we're going to look at how Satir changed the therapy room and why many of her ideas still sound surprisingly modern today. Virginia Satir was born in Wisconsin in 1916. One of the most interesting things about her career is that she didn't begin as a psychotherapist. She began as a teacher. That background actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the therapist she eventually became. Satir was deeply interested in how people learn, communicate, relate to one another, and develop their sense of themselves. She eventually moved into social work and then psychotherapy, where she became increasingly interested in something that wasn't always the focus of traditional psychiatric treatment at the time: the family. In the early 1950s, Satir began working directly with families, and she became increasingly convinced that treating only the individual often was not enough. She eventually moved to California and became one of the early major figures associated with Mental Health Research Institute in Palo Alto. Her work helped establish family therapy as an important field and later expanded into what became known as the Satir Growth Model. Oxford's Encyclopedia of Social Work describes her as someone who helped develop the foundational ideas about human interaction and communication that continue to guide family therapy today. Here is where Satir's thinking becomes particularly interesting. Imagine a family brings in their teenager to therapy. The teenager is angry, they're skipping school, they're fighting with their parents, they're labeled the problem. And so the therapist begins treating the teenager. But Satir encouraged therapists to take a step back and ask a different question. What is happening around the person? In family therapy, this person can be described as the identified patient, the family member whose behavior has become the focus of concern. Satir challenged the assumption that the identified patient necessarily represented the entire problem. Maybe the teenager is acting out because of conflict between the parents. Maybe the family has rules that make emotional expression almost impossible. Maybe one person has become the scapegoat for the tension that exists throughout the family. That doesn't mean the individual symptoms aren't real. It means the symptoms may have a context, and that was a major shift. Instead of asking only, how do we change this person, Satir was asking, what happens when we change the relationships around the person? Satir's work fits naturally well with what we now call systems thinking. The basic idea is relatively simple. People influence their families, and families influence the people within them. Think of it as a cycle: individual, family, individual. One person's behavior changes the reactions of everybody else. Those reactions then influence the original person's behavior, and over time, these interactions become patterns. Families develop roles. They develop rules. They develop expectations about who is allowed to express anger, who keeps the peace, who takes responsibility, who gets blamed, and who stays quiet. The important point is that these patterns don't necessarily develop because people consciously choose them. They can develop as ways of surviving and adapting. Satir's job wasn't simply to identify who was right or wrong. It was to help the family see the pattern and create new possibilities within it. For Satir, communication was the center of family life. Think about what happens when communication breaks down. People stop saying what they actually feel. They make assumptions. They become defensive. They criticize, withdraw. They say one thing while communicating something completely different through the tone or body language. And these patterns can become self-reinforcing. One person becomes defensive, so another person becomes more critical. The criticism increases, so the first person withdraws. The withdrawal increases the other person's frustration, and suddenly everyone is reacting to everybody else. Satir identified several predictable ways people communicate when their self-worth feels threatened. She calls these communication stances, and once you hear them, you may recognize some of them immediately. The first stance is placating. This is the person who says, "Whatever you want is fine." They may give up their own needs in order to prevent conflict. The second stance is blaming. This is all your fault. Blaming can create a sense of control by placing responsibility entirely on somebody else. Then there's what Satir called super reasonable, sometimes represented as the computer. This person removes emotion from the conversation. Everything becomes facts, logics, and analysis. You could be having an incredibly painful conversation with them, and they respond as if they're reading a technical manual. Then there's the irrelevant stance, sometimes called the distractor. The issue comes up, and suddenly the conversation goes somewhere completely different. We're talking about your drinking. Well, you never listened to me anyways. And now they're discussing something else. But Satir believed there was a healthier alternative. She called it congruent communication. Congruents mean that what you're saying, what you're feeling, and what your body is communicating are what you actually intend and are more closely aligned. You're not pretending, you're not attacking, you're not disappearing, you're actually present in the conversation. And that distinction became one of the most important ideas in her model. Let's make congruence practical. Imagine you're angry with your partner. A blaming response might be, "You never care about me." A placating response might be, "It's fine, don't worry about it." A super reasonable response might turn the entire conversation into a debate about the facts. And an irrelevant response might simply change the topic. Congruent sounds different. It might sound like, "I'm really hurt by what's happening and I want to talk about it without attacking you." That's a very different kind of communication. You're acknowledging your emotion without making the other person responsible for your entire emotional experience. You're also not abandoning yourself by simply maintaining the peace. For Satir, healthy communication wasn't about saying everything that comes into your head. It was about being honest, respectful, and emotionally present and connected. In other words, I can tell you what is true for me without making you the enemy. Satir connected communication to something even deeper: self-esteem. She believed the way people relate to others is strongly influenced by how they experience their own worth. If someone fundamentally believes they're not good enough, they may become overly dependent on others for validation. They may become defensive when criticized. They may try to control situations. They may withdraw. Or they may constantly adapt themselves to other people because expressing their own needs feels unsafe. So Satir wasn't simply teaching families how to communicate better, she was asking a lot of deeper questions. What does this person believe about themselves? Because if I don't believe I have worth, authentic communication becomes difficult. If I believe my needs don't matter, I may placate. If I believe I have to protect myself at all costs, I may blame. And if I don't feel safe enough to be emotionally present, I may hide behind logic or distraction. This is one of the places where Satir connected individual psychology with family relationships. Change the way people experience themselves, and you begin to change the way they relate to one another. Now we get to one of Satir's most visually interesting techniques: family sculpting. Instead of sitting in chairs and simply talking about the family, Satir could have family members physically position themselves to represent how they experience their relationships. Think about what allows a therapist to see who is standing close, who is far away, who is turned towards someone or who is turned away from them, who appears powerful, who looks isolated, who's caught in the middle. Suddenly, something that might take an hour to explain verbally can become visible in seconds. And that matters because family patterns aren't always easy to describe. People may not have the words for what they're experiencing, but they can often demonstrate it. Satir's use of sculpting was part of her broader experiential approach. Rather than only talking about the problem, she wanted people to experience and observe the pattern. The Virginia Satir Center continues to teach family reconstruction and sculpting as part of the Satir tradition today. Family reconstruction took this idea even further. Instead of simply examining the family that someone lives with today, reconstruction explores the person's family of origin. The question becomes, what did you learn about relationships growing up? What did you learn about love, about anger, about authority, about vulnerability, about what happens when someone makes a mistake? And, perhaps most importantly, what did your family teach you about yourself? Satir was interested in the idea that people carry forward patterns from previous generations, not necessarily because someone consciously decided to, but because those patterns become familiar ways of surviving and relating. Family reconstruction uses experiential techniques such as mapping, sculpting, and role play to make those patterns more visible. The goal wasn't simply to blame parents or to dig endlessly into the past. It was to understand the system you came from well enough to recognize, this is something I learned. It doesn't necessarily have to be something I continue. That distinction is extremely important. Understanding your history can create the possibility of choice. This brings us to another important part of Satir's work. She wasn't simply interested in diagnosing dysfunctional families. Her later work became increasingly focused on human growth, validation, and transformation. Satir believed that people had internal resources and capacities for growth. Even when someone's behavior looked unhealthy or destructive, she encouraged therapists to look for human need underneath it. Instead of seeing a person as simply resistant, difficult, or dysfunctional, the therapist could ask, what is this person trying to accomplish? What needs are they trying to meet? What are they protecting? What did they learn in order to survive? This doesn't mean every behavior is healthy or acceptable. It means we can understand behavior without reducing the person to the behavior. This is a very humanistic idea, and it helps explain why Satir's work eventually became much more than family structure. It became about helping people experience themselves as capable of growth. So where did all of this lead? Satir's influence extends across several areas of counseling. First, family therapy. She helped establish the idea that relationships and interaction patterns belong in the therapy room. Second, communication therapy. Her communication stances and emphasis on congruence gave therapists a practical way to examine how people interact under stress. Third, humanistic psychology. Satir emphasized dignity, self-worth, choice, connection, and human potential. Fourth, experiential therapy. Techniques such as sculpting and reconstruction move therapy beyond simply talking about problems. And finally, personal growth. Her work increasingly emphasized helping people become more aware, more authentic, and more capable of meaningful connection. Oxford's Encyclopedia of Social Work specifically identifies her contributions to family therapy, human interaction, communication, family sculpting, family reconstruction, and personal growth. That's pretty remarkable range for one therapist. And this is why Virginia Satir shouldn't simply be treated as a historical figure. A therapist working today might still ask, how does this family communicate? What roles have developed? Who is allowed to express emotion? What happens when someone disagrees? Where does shame enter the system? Who gets blamed? Who stays silent? And what would healthier communication actually look like? Those questions remain relevant whether you're working with a family, a couple, a teenager, or an individual. Because even when someone comes into therapy alone, they don't exist in a vacuum. They have relationships. They have learned ways of communicating. They have expectations about themselves and others. They have histories and patterns. Satir reminds us that therapy isn't always about finding what's wrong with a person. Sometimes it's about helping people understand the patterns they've learned and discovering that they can learn something different. Virginia Satir left us with a very different way of looking at people. She challenged therapists to look beyond symptoms and see relationships, beyond behavior to see the human being, beyond dysfunction to see the possibility for growth. And perhaps one of the most useful ways to summarize her legacy is this. Sometimes the person who appears to be the problem is simply the person showing us that something in the system needs attention. That doesn't mean we ignore individual responsibility. It means we widen the lens. When we ask what is happening between people, what patterns have developed, and what beliefs are being reinforced, and what we could change. Satir believed that healthier relationships begin with awareness, honest communication, self-worth, and connection. Those ideas continue to influence family therapy and counseling today. I'm Daniel with The Quiet Mind. If you want to learn more about psychology, counseling, family therapy, and practical mental health skills, follow along for the next episode in the series. We'll see you next time.